Sometimes the people who look completely broken are the ones carrying the most extraordinary promise. The rain had already washed away the last colors of the evening when Ethan Carter guided his black sedan through the quiet streets of Manhattan. The city still pulsed with its usual energy, headlights stretching across slick pavement like ribbons of liquid gold, but inside the car there was only silence. At 34, Ethan had everything business magazines admired. He owned one of the fastest-growing technology companies in America, lived in a penthouse overlooking Central Park, and had enough wealth to buy almost anything he wanted. Yet every night seemed to end exactly the same way, with another meeting finished, another contract signed, and another drive home that felt strangely empty. His phone buzzed again with another congratulatory message about the company's latest acquisition. He glanced at the screen, then muted it without reading another word. Success had become predictable. Loneliness had become routine. As the traffic light turned red near Riverside Park, something beyond the windshield caught his attention. People hurried beneath umbrellas, rushing toward warm apartments and late dinners, careful not to linger in the cold spring rain. They passed a wooden bench without slowing down. No one seemed to notice the young woman sitting there alone. She wasn't asking anyone for help. She wasn't holding a sign. She wasn't even looking around. She simply sat perfectly still, her shoulders trembling beneath a faded gray coat while both arms wrapped tightly around a small wooden box resting in her lap. It wasn't an expensive box. The corners were worn smooth with age, and the brass latch had faded to a dull brown. Yet she held it with the kind of desperate care people usually reserved for priceless treasures. Ethan couldn't explain why that image unsettled him. It wasn't the tears running silently down her cheeks. It wasn't the rain soaking through her clothes. It was the way she protected that little box as though losing it would mean losing the last piece of herself. The light turned green. Cars behind him honked impatiently. For a brief second he almost pressed the accelerator like everyone expected. Instead, he pulled toward the curb. He stepped into the cold rain without opening his umbrella, the water instantly darkening the shoulders of his tailored navy coat. As he approached, the woman never looked up. Her pale blonde hair clung to her face while her fingers tightened around the wooden box. Ethan stopped several feet away, careful not to startle her. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. She remained silent. Only the rain answered. After another moment she wiped her face with the sleeve of her coat but still refused to meet his eyes. "If you need a ride somewhere, I can help." She slowly shook her head. "Money?" Ethan offered quietly. "A hotel for the night? Dinner? Whatever you need." This time she finally looked up. Her blue eyes were red from crying, but there was no anger inside them, only exhaustion that seemed far older than her 26 years. "I don't need your money," she whispered. Her voice was soft but steady. "Then tell me what you do need." For several long seconds she searched his face as though trying to decide whether strangers could still be trusted. Finally she lowered her gaze back to the wooden box. "Can you tell me where St. Matthew Children's Home used to be?" Ethan frowned. The name meant nothing to him. "I don't think I've ever heard of it." A faint smile appeared through her tears, sad enough to break something inside him. "Most people haven't." She stood carefully, still holding the box against her chest, and turned toward the dark street. "Thank you for stopping anyway." Before Ethan could say another word, she began walking into the rain. He watched her disappear beneath the glow of distant streetlights until only her silhouette remained, small against the endless city. Then she was gone. Ethan stayed beside the empty bench much longer than he intended. For reasons he couldn't explain, he couldn't stop thinking about the question she had asked or the worn wooden box she refused to let go. He had spent years believing every problem had a solution if someone had enough resources. Yet tonight, for the first time in a very long while, he had met someone whose heartbreak couldn't be measured in dollars, and somehow that frightened him far more than any business risk ever had. The next morning should have felt ordinary, but Ethan carried the image of the young woman with him into every meeting. While executives discussed quarterly projections and expansion plans, his thoughts drifted back to the rain, the trembling hands around the weathered wooden box, and the quiet question that had lingered long after she disappeared. St. Matthew Children's Home. The name echoed in his mind like an unfinished sentence. During a short break, he asked his assistant, Claire, to look it up. She returned 20 minutes later with an apologetic expression. There are no current records, she said. There was an orphanage by that name decades ago, but it closed years ago. Most of its files were transferred somewhere else. Ethan nodded slowly. Can you find out where? Claire hesitated. I will try. He thanked her, but something told him that paperwork alone would never explain the sadness he had seen in those blue eyes. Meanwhile, across the city, Grace Bennett sat inside a small public library near the Upper West Side. The building was warm, quiet, and filled with the comforting smell of old books. Her damp coat hung across the back of a chair while the wooden box rested carefully beside her. She opened it with practiced hands, revealing its simple contents. Inside lay a faded photograph of two little girls smiling in front of a brick building with a wooden sign that read St. Matthew Children's Home. Beneath the picture rested several handwritten letters tied together with a blue ribbon, a small silver key that no longer shined, and a child's drawing made with wax crayons. The picture showed two stick figures holding hands beneath an oversized yellow sun. Across the top, written in uneven letters, were the words, "Always together." Grace gently traced the drawing with her fingertips before closing her eyes. I am still trying, she whispered so softly that no one nearby could hear. I promised. Her phone buzzed with another disappointing message from yet another agency informing her that there were still no updates regarding historical adoption records. She thanked them anyway before slipping the phone back into her pocket. Hope had become something fragile. Every unanswered email, every closed office, every missing document made the search feel impossible. Yet she refused to stop. That promise had carried her through years of uncertainty, and it was the only reason she had come back to New York. Late that afternoon, Ethan left the office earlier than usual, ignoring the surprised looks from his staff. Instead of returning to his penthouse, he drove toward Riverside Park almost without thinking. He told himself it was coincidence. Deep down, he knew it was not. The bench where he had found Grace the night before now sat empty beneath bright spring sunshine. Children laughed in the distance while joggers passed along the riverside path. Everything looked peaceful, almost ordinary. Ethan stood there for several minutes before noticing a volunteer unloading boxes of donated food outside a nearby community center. As he walked closer, he suddenly froze. Grace was there. She had exchanged her damp gray coat for a simple cream-colored sweater, and although dark circles remained beneath her eyes, she greeted every visitor with genuine warmth. She smiled at elderly neighbors, carried heavy boxes without complaint, and handed grocery bags to struggling families before quietly stepping aside so someone else could receive the thanks. She moved with quiet purpose, never drawing attention to herself. Ethan watched from across the sidewalk, confused. Last night she had looked like someone who had lost everything. Today she was giving away the little strength she still had. Just as he considered walking over, an elderly volunteer handed Grace a paper lunch bag. She thanked him politely, then almost immediately noticed an exhausted man sitting alone near the entrance. Without hesitation, she carried the meal to him, smiled gently, and returned with empty hands. Only then did Ethan realize she had given away the lunch that had been meant for herself. Grace finished stacking the last crate of canned food just as the afternoon sun slipped behind a row of tall buildings, casting long shadows across the community center parking lot. The volunteers slowly headed home, laughing quietly as they wished one another a safe evening, but Grace remained behind to sweep the sidewalk, refusing to leave until every folding table had been carried inside. Ethan watched from across the street, hidden by the steady flow of pedestrians. Nothing about her behavior matched what he expected. Most people facing hardship instinctively protected what little they had left. Grace seemed to do the opposite. She gave away her lunch without hesitation, stayed later than anyone else, and smiled with genuine kindness that never looked forced. When the last volunteer locked the front door, Grace picked up her worn backpack and carefully lifted the same wooden box Ethan had noticed the night before. She cradled it against her chest before beginning the short walk toward a nearby subway station. Without fully deciding to, Ethan followed at a respectful distance. She stopped outside a small neighborhood coffee shop, not to go inside, but to stand in front of the large window. Children sat around a table coloring pictures while their parents talked over steaming cups of coffee. Grace smiled softly at the scene before quietly continuing down the block. A few minutes later she entered an aging brick church whose doors remained open throughout the day. Ethan waited outside, uncertain whether he should leave. Nearly half an hour passed before Grace emerged again. Her eyes were calmer now, though the quiet sadness had not disappeared. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, the wooden box slipped slightly from her arms. Ethan instinctively moved forward just as a small silver key slid across the concrete. Grace gasped and hurried after it, but Ethan reached it first. He bent down, picked up the tiny key, and held it out carefully. Their eyes met once again. "Thank you," she said with a tired smile. "This one cannot be replaced." Ethan placed the key gently into her palm instead of asking questions. "It looks important." Grace looked down at it for several silent seconds before nodding. "It opens something I have never stopped looking for." Ethan frowned slightly. "A house?" She shook her head. "Not exactly." Before he could ask another question, the wooden box shifted again, and one folded drawing slipped onto the sidewalk. Grace immediately reached for it, but the paper unfolded in the breeze before either of them could stop it. Ethan caught only a brief glimpse. Two little girls stood beneath an enormous yellow sun, holding hands with bright smiles stretching across their simple crayon faces. Across the top, written in uneven childish letters, were the words, "Always together." Grace quickly folded the drawing again, her fingers trembling more from emotion than embarrassment. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I should be more careful." Ethan looked at the drawing, then back at her. "Someone gave that to you?" She closed the wooden box with unusual care, as though sealing away years of memories. "Someone made me a promise." Her voice nearly disappeared beneath the sound of a passing bus. "And I made one in return." Ethan noticed that she did not cry this time. Instead, she carried the weight of those memories with remarkable quiet strength. For the first time in years, he realized there were stories that could not be understood by reading financial reports or public records. Some stories survived only through faded photographs, worn wooden boxes, tiny silver keys, and drawings made by little hands long ago. Grace offered him one final grateful smile before walking toward the subway entrance. Ethan remained standing on the sidewalk, watching until the crowd swallowed her from view. He glanced down at the empty stretch of concrete where the drawing had briefly rested. The words lingered in his mind long after she disappeared. "Always together." Somehow he knew they were not simply the hopeful words of a child. They were the beginning of a promise that someone, somewhere, had never been allowed to keep. The following morning Ethan arrived at his office carrying something far heavier than the leather briefcase in his hand. Throughout breakfast, during the elevator ride, and even while reviewing investment proposals, his thoughts kept returning to Grace, the weathered wooden box, the tiny silver key, and the faded drawing that simply read "Always together." Nothing about her fit the assumptions he usually made about people. She never asked for money. She never tried to impress anyone. She carried sorrow with remarkable dignity, yet somehow found the strength to brighten the lives of complete strangers. Shortly before noon Claire knocked gently on his office door carrying a thin folder. "I found a little information about St. Matthew Children's Home," she said. Ethan immediately looked up. "Tell me." Claire placed the folder on his desk. "It closed almost 18 years ago after financial problems forced the property to be sold. Many of the children's records were transferred to different agencies, but several archives were lost during the transition. Most public files simply end there." Ethan slowly turned the yellowed pages. There were only a few newspaper clippings and an old photograph of the brick building. The entrance looked strangely familiar. Then he remembered the faded picture inside Grace's wooden box. It had been taken in front of that exact doorway. "Is there anyone who worked there?" he asked. Claire pointed to one name highlighted near the bottom of the page. "One former volunteer still manages a neighborhood history center in Brooklyn. Her name is Margaret Collins." Ethan closed the folder. "Clear my afternoon." Less than an hour later he found himself standing inside a modest historical society filled with dusty shelves, framed photographs, and cardboard boxes labeled by decade. Behind an old wooden desk sat an elderly woman with kind eyes and silver hair tied into a loose bun. Margaret welcomed him warmly before listening carefully as he mentioned St. Matthew Children's Home. Her expression softened immediately. "Not many people ask about that place anymore," she said quietly. "Those children deserve to be remembered." Ethan hesitated before choosing his next words. "I met someone who seems connected to it." Margaret smiled gently. "Then perhaps you should meet someone else first." She handed him a folded flyer advertising a weekly volunteer dinner at the same community center where Grace had been helping. Many former volunteers gather there on Thursdays. Sometimes old stories find their way home when people least expect it. That evening Ethan arrived carrying several boxes of donated blankets from his company's charitable foundation, hoping his visit would appear natural rather than planned. Inside the community center the atmosphere felt warm and welcoming. Families shared meals, volunteers laughed together, and children colored quietly at one corner table while older neighbors exchanged stories over coffee. Grace stood near the serving counter wearing a simple blue volunteer apron. When she noticed Ethan walking through the door, surprise flashed across her face before she smiled politely. "You found the place," she said. Ethan returned the smile. "I brought a few donations. I hope that is all right. People here will appreciate them." Together they carried the boxes into a storage room lined with neatly organized shelves. The small space felt peaceful, broken only by the sound of rain beginning to tap softly against the windows outside. As they arranged the blankets, Ethan glanced toward the wooden box resting carefully on a nearby chair. "You never let it out of your sight," he observed gently. Grace looked at the box before answering. "Some people inherit fortunes. I inherited memories." Ethan remained silent, allowing the words to settle between them. After a moment Grace continued, her voice thoughtful rather than sad. "The strange thing about memories is that they become heavier every year unless someone helps you carry them." Ethan looked at her with quiet understanding. For the first time since they met, she did not seem like a stranger standing on the other side of an invisible wall. Instead, she seemed like someone slowly deciding whether it was finally safe to let another person walk beside her. The following week settled into an unexpected rhythm neither Ethan nor Grace had planned. Every Thursday evening he arrived at the community center carrying donations that his company quietly supplied, but he never announced where they came from. He simply rolled the boxes through the front door, greeted the volunteers by name, and spent the next few hours doing whatever needed to be done. Sometimes he sorted canned food. Sometimes he swept the floor after dinner. Other nights he helped carry folding tables back into storage. Grace noticed that no task ever seemed too small for him, and that surprised her more than his expensive watch or perfectly tailored suits. One evening, after the last family had gone home, they sat on the front steps watching the city lights flicker against the dark sky. The air carried the scent of fresh rain, and for the first time their conversation drifted away from practical matters. Ethan admitted that he had built his company by believing every obstacle could be solved through strategy, discipline, and relentless work. Grace listened quietly before smiling. "Some things are not problems," she said softly. "Some things are simply wounds. They need time more than solutions." Her words lingered in his thoughts long after she finished speaking. The next afternoon Ethan found himself canceling another unnecessary dinner with investors. Instead, he walked through Central Park alone, something he had not done in years. He noticed children sailing toy boats across the pond, grandparents laughing on benches, and couples sharing simple conversations that required no agenda. Success had always pushed him toward the next achievement, but Grace somehow reminded him that life happened in the quiet spaces between accomplishments. A few days later, Grace invited him to help organize donated books inside a neighborhood learning center connected to the community church. Dust floated through narrow beams of afternoon sunlight as they arranged worn novels, dictionaries, and children's picture books onto freshly painted shelves. While unpacking another box, Ethan discovered several sketch pads and colored pencils. Grace's face brightened with genuine excitement. "These will make someone very happy," she said. She carefully placed the supplies onto a separate table before explaining that children often expressed feelings they could not yet describe with words. Ethan watched her kneel beside a little boy who shyly asked whether he could draw a rocket ship. She encouraged him with patient kindness, never taking over the page, only reminding him that every great picture began with one simple line. The moment stirred something deep inside Ethan. He remembered sitting alone as a young boy in the enormous house where he grew up, surrounded by every expensive toy imaginable, but wishing someone would simply sit beside him for a while. His parents had loved him in the ways they understood, providing opportunity instead of presents. Looking at Grace now, he realized she gave people the one gift money could never purchase. She made them feel seen. As the center prepared to close, Grace carefully removed the wooden box from her backpack and placed it on a nearby table while she gathered the remaining supplies. Ethan glanced toward it but said nothing. She noticed anyway. "You are wondering why I carry it everywhere," she said. He nodded honestly. Grace rested one hand on the worn lid before answering. "Because every clue I have left is inside. If I lose this box, I lose the map that has guided me for almost 18 years. Ethan looked at the faded brass latch, the tiny scratches carved into the wood by time, and the silver key resting safely inside. For the first time he understood that he was no longer simply curious about Grace's past. Without realizing when it had happened, her search had quietly become important to him as well, and somewhere deep inside his heart, a life once defined only by quarterly goals had begun measuring success in an entirely different way. Several evenings later, after the last volunteer had locked the doors of the learning center, Grace and Ethan walked slowly toward Riverside Park with 2 paper cups of hot tea warming their hands against the cool spring air. The city felt unusually quiet, as though even the traffic had agreed to give the night a moment of peace. They settled onto the same wooden bench where Ethan had first found her crying days earlier. This time there were no tears waiting behind her eyes, only a thoughtful silence. For several minutes neither of them spoke. The familiar wooden box rested between them, its worn edges glowing softly beneath the nearby street lamp. Finally Grace took a slow breath and rested both hands on the lid. "You asked me once what I really needed," she said quietly. "I think you deserve an honest answer." Ethan nodded without interrupting. Grace opened the box with careful hands and removed the faded photograph of the 2 smiling little girls standing in front of St. Matthew Children's Home. She handed it to Ethan. "That is me on the left," she said, pointing toward the older child. "The little girl beside me is my younger sister, Lily." Ethan studied the picture before looking back at Grace. "She looks so much like you." A gentle smile crossed Grace's face, disappearing almost as quickly as it appeared. "She used to follow me everywhere. Every night she insisted that I tell her the same story before we went to sleep. She believed that as long as we stayed together, nothing bad could ever happen." Grace unfolded the crayon drawing next. The oversized yellow sun and the words "always together" looked even more fragile beneath the park lights. "She made this for me on my 10th birthday, Grace whispered. "She said the sun was so big because it would always find us, even if we got lost." Ethan remained completely still, allowing her memories to find their own pace. Grace swallowed hard before continuing. "When the children's home closed, everything changed in one afternoon. We were told different families were interested in adoption. I promised Lily we would never let go of each other." Her voice trembled for the first time. "I held her hand until someone gently pulled us apart. I kept telling her I would find her again soon." She closed her eyes briefly, fighting emotions she had carried for nearly 2 decades. Soon became months. Months became years. Every letter I wrote disappeared into offices that no longer existed. Every phone call led to another missing record. Every address had already changed. She picked up the small silver key and turned it slowly between her fingers. This key belonged to the tiny wooden cabinet beside our beds at St. Matthew. Lily hid little treasures inside it. Pebbles. Buttons. Dried flowers. She told me the key was lucky, so she gave it to me before we were separated. Ethan looked at the tiny piece of silver with entirely new understanding. It was never just a key. It was the last gift from a little sister who had trusted her completely. Grace's voice grew softer. People thought I was crying because life had become difficult. They were wrong. I cried because I was afraid I was running out of time. I promised a little girl that I would bring her home, and every birthday that passes feels like another promise I have failed to keep. Ethan felt a weight settle deep inside his chest. He had spent years believing that wealth could solve almost anything, yet no amount of money could erase 18 years of waiting or heal the quiet guilt that Grace carried every single day. Looking at the faded photograph in his hands, he silently made a promise of his own. Whatever it took, he would help her finish the journey she had refused to abandon, because no child should spend a lifetime wondering whether the person who loved them had forgotten. The promise Ethan made that night refused to leave him. Early the next morning, before the first executive meeting appeared on his calendar, he called Claire into his office carrying the wooden photograph from his memory rather than any business report. He explained everything Grace had shared, from St. Matthew Children's Home to the missing adoption records and the little sister she had spent 18 years searching for. Claire listened without interrupting, then quietly said, "If the records disappeared when the home closed, there is still a chance someone preserved copies." Older charities often partnered with private foundations. Ethan immediately asked her to trace every organization that had financially supported St. Matthew before it closed. Hours later, Claire returned carrying several archived documents collected from public libraries, newspaper databases, and nonprofit registries. Most of the names meant nothing to Ethan until he reached the final page. His eyes stopped on a familiar logo. Carter Family Foundation. He stared at it for several long seconds, convinced he had misunderstood. The foundation had been established decades earlier by his late grandfather, long before Ethan became its chairman. According to the records, the foundation had provided emergency funding to several children's homes across New York, including St. Matthew during its final years. Ethan slowly lowered the page, an uneasy feeling settling deep inside him. His family's organization had not caused the home to close, but it had been connected to the transition process that followed. Somewhere within those forgotten archives might be the answers Grace had been searching for all these years. That afternoon he visited the foundation headquarters, a quiet limestone building only a few blocks from his corporate office. Most employees recognized him immediately, but instead of discussing donations or annual reports, he requested access to every historical archive connected to St. Matthew Children's Home. The archivist, an elderly man named Harold Green, adjusted his glasses before leading Ethan into a climate-controlled storage room lined with shelves of carefully labeled boxes. Dust had not touched the files in years. Harold explained that many paper records had been preserved after organizations closed, even when government offices reorganized their own systems. Ethan spent hours opening folders, reading handwritten notes, shipping manifests, and correspondence between social workers. Just as the afternoon light faded through the narrow windows, one sealed envelope caught his attention. Across the front someone had written, "Transfer records pending confirmation." Inside were several incomplete placement logs listing children whose adoption files required additional verification before being permanently archived. One line had been highlighted in faded blue ink. Lily Bennett. Ethan's heart raced. Beside her name appeared a note stating that her placement had been transferred through another partner organization because of administrative restructuring. The destination file number was partially missing, but one code remained perfectly legible. Harold leaned closer and nodded thoughtfully. That code belongs to the Hope Haven Adoption Network. They merged with another agency many years ago. Ethan carefully photographed the reference number before returning every document exactly as he had found it. On the drive home he could hardly focus on the traffic around him. For the first time there was something more than hope. There was a real trail waiting to be followed. Yet another realization weighed just as heavily on his mind. If he told Grace immediately, she would undoubtedly thank him, but she might also believe he was trying to rescue her with influence rather than simply walking beside her. He remembered what she had once told him. Some things were not problems. They were wounds. Wounds needed time more than solutions. So instead of calling her that evening, Ethan made a different decision. He would continue following the trail quietly until he knew the truth. Grace had carried her promise alone for 18 years. The least he could do was make certain that the next piece of hope he placed in her hands would be real. The breakthrough arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning, hidden inside a single line of faded ink that almost everyone else would have overlooked. Ethan sat across from Harold Green once again as another storage box was carefully placed on the long archive table. Hope Haven Adoption Network had transferred thousands of paper records when it merged with a larger family services organization nearly 15 years earlier. Most had already been digitized, but several confidential files remained in secure physical storage because of outdated privacy regulations. With the proper legal authorization from the Carter Family Foundation, Harold had finally received permission to review the remaining index books. Ethan watched quietly as page after page turned beneath white archival gloves. Suddenly Harold stopped. His finger rested on a familiar file number. "This is the continuation record," he whispered. Ethan leaned forward. The name Lily Bennett appeared once again, followed by a new surname and a placement notation that had never been copied into any public database. More importantly, another document listed the licensed social worker responsible for supervising the adoption. She had retired years earlier but was still alive in upstate New York. Ethan thanked Harold sincerely before driving there the very next morning. The retired social worker, Eleanor Watkins, welcomed him into a modest farmhouse surrounded by flowering dogwood trees. She listened carefully as Ethan explained Grace's 18-year search. Eleanor closed her eyes for a long moment before quietly disappearing into another room. When she returned, she carried a worn leather binder filled with handwritten notes that she had been permitted to keep after retirement. "I always prayed the sisters would find each other again," she said gently. Together they reviewed the pages until Eleanor stopped at one final entry. "The younger sister was adopted by a wonderful family," she explained. "Her name was legally changed to Lily Anderson. They moved to Connecticut a few months later." Ethan felt hope rise inside him, but Eleanor raised one careful finger. "Please remember something. An address on paper tells you where someone lived years ago. It does not tell you where they are today." Ethan nodded. "I understand." Over the following week he resisted every temptation to use wealth or influence to force quick answers. Instead, he hired a licensed family reunification specialist whose only role was to follow the legal process with patience and respect. Public records were reviewed. Archived school directories were cross-referenced. Former neighbors were contacted politely. Every step honored privacy rather than bypassing it. Grace knew nothing about any of it. She continued volunteering at the community center, organizing donated books, and encouraging children to believe in brighter tomorrows even while her own greatest hope remained uncertain. One evening she noticed Ethan seemed distracted. "You look like someone carrying a secret," she said with a gentle smile. Ethan laughed softly. "Maybe I am carrying hope instead." Grace tilted her head curiously but did not press him further. She had learned that some answers arrived only after enough patience. 3 days later Ethan received a call from the reunification specialist. A woman named Lily Anderson had been located. She was living less than 90 miles from Manhattan, working as an elementary school music teacher. Most astonishing of all, according to the specialist, Lily had spent years making quiet inquiries of her own, hoping someone might someday help her find the older sister she remembered only through fragments of childhood. Ethan lowered the phone slowly, overwhelmed by the beautiful symmetry of it all. Grace had never stopped searching for Lily, And somewhere just beyond the city, Lily had never stopped wondering whether Grace had kept her promise. Ethan looked through the office window toward the evening skyline. The faded photograph, the tiny silver key, the crayon drawing beneath the oversized yellow sun, and the weathered wooden box suddenly felt less like reminders of loss and more like signposts leading two separated hearts back toward one another. For the first time since that rainy night in Riverside Park, Ethan believed the promise made by two little girls might finally be fulfilled. The following Saturday morning Ethan invited Grace to meet him at Riverside Park, saying only that there was someone who wanted to tell her a story. She arrived carrying the familiar wooden box, her expression curious but calm. The spring air was gentle, and sunlight shimmered across the river exactly where rain had fallen on the night they first met. Ethan greeted her with a warm smile that carried both excitement and quiet emotion. "Before we go any farther," he said softly, "there is something you need to know. I did not stop searching after our conversation on this bench." Grace looked at him in surprise, but before she could respond, another woman slowly approached along the walking path. She appeared to be in her mid-20s, with bright blue eyes and blonde hair touched by the same golden shade as Grace's. Around her neck hung a small silver necklace with a tiny sun-shaped charm. She stopped several feet away, her hands trembling gently. For a long moment neither woman spoke. They simply looked at one another, searching familiar features that time had never completely erased. Then the younger woman whispered the two words Grace had replayed in her heart for 18 years. "Grace. It is me." The wooden box slipped from Grace's hands onto the grass, its brass latch opening just enough for the faded drawing to slide into the sunlight. Tears filled her eyes as she stepped forward one careful pace at a time. "Lily," she whispered, hardly believing her own voice. The younger woman nodded through joyful tears. "I never stopped hoping you would find me." The distance between them disappeared in an instant as the sisters embraced with the quiet relief of two hearts finally coming home. There were no grand speeches, only whispered apologies that neither of them needed to make and promises they had already kept simply by refusing to forget each other. After they sat together beneath a nearby oak tree, Lily explained that her adoptive family had loved her deeply and encouraged her to search once she became an adult. She had contacted agencies, written letters, and checked every record she could legally access, but each search ended where Grace's had ended, with missing files and unanswered questions. Grace reached into the wooden box and carefully unfolded the crayon drawing. Lily gasped the moment she saw it. "You kept it." Grace smiled through happy tears. "I kept everything." She handed Lily the tiny silver key. "This always belonged to both of us." Lily closed her fingers around it before gently placing it back into Grace's hand. "No," she said softly. "It carried you all the way to me. Now it belongs with the box." Ethan watched quietly from a respectful distance, grateful that he had never tried to rush the journey. The greatest gift he could offer had not been money or influence. It had been patience, persistence, and faith that love deserved another chance. Several months later the community center celebrated the opening of a new family resource program funded jointly by the Carter Family Foundation and organized by Grace and Lily. Above the entrance hung a simple wooden sign that read "Every child comes home." Inside the welcome room, protected behind glass, rested the weathered wooden box, the faded photograph, the little silver key, and the crayon drawing beneath the oversized yellow sun. A small plaque carried one sentence: "Hope is strongest when someone refuses to stop looking." As guests gathered for the dedication, Ethan quietly took Grace's hand. "The night we met," he said with a gentle smile, "I thought I was trying to save a stranger." Grace looked at him with grateful eyes and softly shook her head. "You were never saving me, Ethan. You reminded me that promises are worth keeping." He reached into his pocket and revealed a simple engagement ring, elegant without extravagance. "Then let me make one more promise," he said. "Whatever tomorrow brings, we will face it together." Grace smiled, her answer shining brighter than the spring sunlight surrounding them. "Yes." And for the first time in many years, the promise two little sisters had written beneath a child's bright yellow sun had finally become true. They were always together.